It was one of those rare, quiet afternoons when the house felt like my own private refuge. The windows were wide open, the sunlight slanting through the trees, casting a golden haze across the living room. I had the place to myself, my parents at work, my sister at school, and for once the peace was uninterrupted. I sank into the couch, remote in hand, and started flicking through TV channels, not really watching anything, just letting the sound of the old sitcoms fill the silence. The heat from the summer sun hung heavy in the air, a reminder that the world outside was alive and moving. But here, in the house on the hill, it felt like time had slowed down. I hadn't been sitting there long when I heard it. The soft chime of the doorbell, breaking the stillness. It was a jarring sound in the middle of nowhere, in a neighborhood so secluded that I rarely even saw cars passing by. At first I figured it was just a mistake. Maybe someone had gotten lost, or maybe the wrong address. I ignored it, not thinking much of it. Visitors were unusual here, and I was used to being alone. But then the doorbell rang again. Once, then twice, and then a third time. My fingers froze on the remote. That wasn't normal. I stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and walked toward the door. I was too cautious to open it right away, too suspicious. There was no peephole to peek through, no way to check who was standing outside without exposing myself. I pressed my ear to the door, straining for any sound, any clue about who was there. But it was quiet. Too quiet. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a heavy, deliberate banging on the door. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't frantic or rushed. It was methodical, as if whoever was outside had all the time in the world. And then from the other side, a voice, deep, rough, and unsettling. "I know you're in there." My heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't shouting, but it wasn't casual either. It was forceful, certain. It sent a chill through me that made me want to shrink into the walls. I stood still, holding my breath, as if somehow that would make me invisible. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, but it felt like hours. I couldn't bring myself to move. I didn't want to look outside, didn't want to confirm that there was indeed someone there, but I couldn't stop my mind from racing. Was it a prank, a mistake, or was something more sinister going on? The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Eventually I heard muffled voices, low and indistinct, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating down the driveway. The weight in my chest didn't lift immediately. I still stood there, unsure whether to move or stay where I was. I felt paralyzed, caught between fear and curiosity, wondering whether I should risk looking through the window to see if anyone was still there. But I didn't. I couldn't. I let out a shaky breath and backed away from the door, unsure of what to think. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some random stranger who knocked on the wrong door. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The whole encounter, the voice, the steady pounding on the door, it felt intentional, deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe, that someone was watching me. But as the minutes turned into an hour, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I tried to tell myself it was just a weird moment, a fluke. Still, my mind refused to let go of the fear. And the house, which had once felt like a quiet refuge, now seemed far too big, too empty, too exposed. I stayed in the same spot long after the footsteps faded, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe too loudly. The house, which had always felt like a safe little bubble, now felt exposed, like someone had been watching it for longer than I wanted to consider. My mind kept circling back to that voice, that deep, deliberate. I know you're in there. It hadn't sounded like a question. It was a statement, a fact, minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I wanted to believe whoever had knocked was gone, but I didn't trust it. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could be heard through the walls. I wanted to check, just a quick glance out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Looking would mean acknowledging the fear, and some part of me still clung to the hope that this was nothing, just some stupid misunderstanding that I could forget about in the morning. Eventually, the rational part of my brain forced me to move. I crept back toward the couch, keeping low, just in case someone was still out there. I sat with my arms wrapped tightly around myself, trying to focus on the flickering light of the television, but I wasn't watching anymore. I was waiting, listening for anything out of place, any shift in the silence. Then, just when I was starting to convince myself that it was over, a sound made my stomach drop. Muffled voices, more than one. They were too quiet to make out, but I knew what I was hearing. They weren't inside, but they were close. I imagined them standing just beyond the porch, whispering to each other, deciding what to do next. I gripped the armrest, fingers digging into the fabric. I wanted to believe they were walking away, but my gut told me otherwise. The voices carried on for another moment. Then, nothing. Just silence. I didn't check the door. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, stiff and unmoving, and waited. I don't know how long I stayed like that. But by the time I dared to shift, the sun had started its slow descent, stretching long golden shadows across the floor. I tried to convince myself that the silence meant safety, that they had left for good. But the fear sat heavy in my chest, refusing to budge. And even though I couldn't see them anymore, I felt it. Somewhere out there they were waiting. By the time the sun had slipped behind the trees, I had almost convinced myself that it was over. Almost. The house was still, the air thick with the heat of the day, but something inside me refused to let go of the unease. I kept the TV on, not for entertainment, but for the noise, anything to break up the suffocating silence. The clock on the wall ticked on, each second stretching longer than it should. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been gripping the armrest of the couch until I felt the ache in my fingers. Then the doorbell rang again. My whole body tensed. My pulse thundered in my ears. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard a car, hadn't heard anything at all, but someone was there. My first instinct was to stay still, to pretend I hadn't heard it, but I already knew that wouldn't work. They had waited hours. They knew I was inside. I forced myself to move, slowly, carefully, making my way toward the side window. I didn't stand up right away. Instead, I crouched low, barely peeking over the sill. The sinking sun cast long shadows across the porch, but there was no mistaking the two figures standing at the door. A woman, dressed entirely in black, stood perfectly still, facing the house. Her long flowing dress looked heavy, the fabric out of place in the oppressive heat. A wide-brimmed hat shielded most of her face, but not enough to hide the way she was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't warm or polite. It was too wide, too knowing, too wrong. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit. He didn't look at the house the way she did. He stood rigid, hands at his sides, his face expressionless, almost bored. Where she was unsettling, he was unreadable. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. They just stood there, waiting. I stayed frozen, watching, heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. Don't move. Don't let them see you. But even as I thought it, a sickening realization settled in my chest. She already knew I was watching. For what felt like forever, they didn't move. The woman just kept smiling, lips stretched too wide, her head tilted ever so slightly, like she was listening for something. Then, as if they had silently come to some unspoken decision, they turned. Without a word, without hesitation, they walked back down the driveway, disappearing into the growing darkness. I stayed by the window long after they were gone, heart still hammering. I should have felt relief. I should have felt safe again, but I didn't, because now I knew for certain they would be back. I stayed by the window long after the woman in black and her silent companion had disappeared down the driveway. My legs ached from crouching, my muscles stiff with tension, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I kept waiting for them to turn back, waiting for some sound, some clue that they were still out there, just beyond my sight. But the world outside remained still. The trees swaying lazily in the evening breeze, the last light of the sun bleeding away into the horizon. When I finally peeled myself away from the window, I moved through the house like I was underwater, slow, deliberate, hyper-aware of every sound. I checked the locks once, twice, 3 times, running my fingers over the deadbolt to make sure it was secure. I closed the curtains, double-checked the windows, even though I already knew they were shut tight. But it wasn't enough. It didn't feel like enough. I tried to sleep. I curled up in bed with the blankets pulled tight around me, listening to the creaks and groans of the house settling in the night. Every shift in the wind, every rustle outside, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I kept picturing the woman's smile, the way she had stood so still, her face angled ever so slightly toward the window, as if she could see me, as if she had been waiting for me to look. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally won. I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with glimpses of dark fabric, of faceless figures standing outside my door. I dreamt that I heard the doorbell again, the sharp chime cutting through the silence, but when I got up to check, there was no one there, just the sound of quiet laughter trailing off into the darkness. When morning came, everything felt different. The house was the same, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the birds chirping outside. It should have felt normal, it should have felt safe, but the unease never fully faded. I checked the driveway, half expecting to find some sign that they had returned in the night, but there was nothing. No footprints, no lingering shadows, just the same empty gravel path stretching down toward the road. I never saw them again. Not the deep-voiced man who had knocked on my door, not the smiling woman in black, not the serious-faced man who had stood beside her. But that didn't mean they weren't real. That didn't mean it hadn't happened. Because even now, all these years later, I still think about them. I still remember the way she stood there, the way she smiled. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, when the air is too still, I find myself listening, waiting, just in case the doorbell rings again.